Have you ever had the strange feeling that something inside you was falling apart, as if old certainties simply stopped making sense, and in their place, an uncomfortable yet mysteriously familiar silence emerged? Many call this a crisis, others, of emotional collapse, but for some, it is the beginning of a process that goes far beyond the mind or emotions. It is the starting point of something deeper, invisible to the eyes, a silent call to a journey of inner awakening. But does this awakening really happen? Or would it just be a modern label for ancient psychological processes, known for centuries by Eastern traditions, Stoic philosophers, or monks secluded in the mountains? Curiously, although the word spirituality is becoming increasingly popular, most of us are unaware that this path has recognizable stages, with emotional, mental, and even physical patterns. But here's the curious detail: there is no straight line. This journey is not one step after another, like concrete stairs. It resembles an irregular spiral. Sometimes we go up, at other times, we return to the same point, but with a different perspective. And this unpredictability is what makes everything even more fascinating and challenging. Studies on altered states of consciousness, such as those conducted in the 1970s by psychiatrists of transpersonal psychology, already indicated that people in stages of spiritual transition reported similar patterns, such as a sense of dislocation from reality, disidentification from their own name, and a strong need for isolation. Curiously, these descriptions are almost identical to those found in 13th century Buddhist texts or in the accounts of the early Desert Fathers of Christianity. So, are you at the beginning of this journey? Or maybe you've already crossed more than half without even realizing it? In this video, we will explore the 5 most common stages of the so-called spiritual journey, from the moment the ego completely dominates to the point where life begins to flow in coherence with what we call essence. But be careful, these stages are not fixed rules, nor spiritual calendars. They are merely reflections of experiences that thousands of seekers have reported over the centuries, and that, perhaps, mirror something you are already living, unnamed. Therefore, when watching, do not try to classify yourself. Instead, observe. Notice where you feel resistance, where it hurts, where it shines. Because maybe, just maybe, your awakening is not at the end, but in the simple act of starting to look. First stage: when we live on autopilot, ego domination. Imagine waking up every day, putting on your clothes, fulfilling your commitments, talking to people, and still feeling like everything is automatic, almost as if someone else is living in your place. You react to situations, but rarely choose. You feel anger, frustration, or fear, and you don't quite know where it comes from. This suffocating feeling, for many, is the starting point of the inner journey. Here, we are faced with what ancient traditions called the sleep of consciousness, a state in which the ego takes complete control of the human experience. But it is not something visible. The ego, in this context, is an invisible mental construct, formed by ideas such as, I am just like this, I need to win, I was hurt, and now I protect myself. But does that really define who you are? At this stage, everything is personal. Any criticism feels like an attack, any mistake, an irreversible failure. And the curious thing is that, although the person feels they have control over their own life, they are actually being driven by inherited unconscious patterns from family, society, and the media. They are automatic responses, almost as if we were trapped in a mental program written decades ago. The philosopher Gurdjieff, in the early 20th century, suggested that 99% of humanity lived in this state of sleep, acting out of conditioning, and not out of real presence. Today, even with so much information available, many still go through life without realizing that they are being guided by this emotional autopilot. Another striking sign of this stage is the constant feeling of separation. The person feels that the world is out there, separate from them. Everything is lived in opposition. Me against others. Me against life. Me against time. This fragmentation makes any real form of empathy difficult. The gaze upon others is always filtered through projections, fears, and judgments, Curiously, it is common for old traumas to reinforce this state. Painful events from the past, even if forgotten, create layers of emotional protection that make us react unconsciously. Don't trust. Defend yourself. Don't show weakness. These commands repeat like silent mantras, and in the meantime, true consciousness, the one that observes in silence, without judgment, remains hidden, buried under internal voices that are not always yours. But here is the key point. Recognizing that you are living on autopilot is already a sign of a break. It's like a crack in the wall of the old self. From the moment this doubt arises, is all of this really me? Something begins to move. It's not the awakening yet, but it is the first noise. The sign that there is something beyond the surface, something waiting to be discovered. Second stage, the collapse of the self. When who you thought you were stops making sense. Have you ever felt like you were watching yourself from the outside, as if your life were a theater and you had suddenly forgotten your role? This disconcerting feeling often marks the beginning of a silent process, the deconstruction of the self you always believed you were. In this second stage, the structure of the ego begins to dissolve. But those who think this happens smoothly are mistaken. It is not uncommon for this phase to be accompanied by existential crises, painful breakups, feelings of emptiness and confusion. What is happening is not a real loss, but rather the detachment of your identity from the social role you learned to play. Here, old labels like profession, name, gender, religion, or status cease to carry weight. You can continue saying your name, but it no longer seems to mean what it used to mean. It's as if, little by little, certainties were slipping through your fingers. What once supported your choices no longer seems solid. You question everything: values, beliefs, promises. And the most unsettling part, you start questioning yourself. Curiously, ancient traditions have always recognized this stage. In Zen, it is called Kensha glimpse, in which one realizes that the constructed personality is not the true self. In Christian mystical texts, there are references to the dark night of the soul, an internal journey marked by the silence of God and the collapse of certainties. Today, psychology calls this depersonalization or identity rupture. Clinical studies from the early 2000s indicate that more than 60% of people who have undergone consciousness-expanding experiences report a phase of strong alienation or detachment from themselves, something that medicine still does not fully understand. But this feeling of being empty is not an end. In fact, it is the necessary pause for something new to be born. It is in this space, now without so many layers, that a different perception begins to emerge, that there is an observer within you, a silent point that does not judge, does not defend itself, does not react, just sees. This point of observation, which some call consciousness, others soul, and still others presence, has always been there, but before it was obscured by the noise of social identity. Now, with the crumbling of the old self, it reveals itself. Is it painful? Often, yes. Is it lonely? Almost always. But it is in this apparent collapse that the door opens to a new vision of oneself. A vision that no longer depends on titles, stories, or others' expectations. It's not the end of the journey. It's just the moment when the stage becomes empty. And for the first time, you can choose whether you really want to keep performing or simply be. Third stage, the call of the invisible. When the search for something greater begins after the collapse of the old identity, something curious happens. In place of the confusion, a different restlessness emerges. It's no longer the desperation for control or the fear of the unknown. It's a subtle, almost inexplicable impulse, an inner call that asks, is there more than all this? It is at this point that the seeker is born, someone who is no longer satisfied with ready-made answers, catchphrases, or inherited beliefs. The need arises to go beyond, to discover for oneself what is true, what is eternal, what lies behind all the masks. This search, however, is rarely orderly. It's like trying to put together a puzzle without knowing what the final image is. Books start to pile up. Videos about spirituality seem like signs, and every sentence with emotional depth stirs something inside. But along with this enthusiasm, there is also a certain anxiety. how to know what is real, which path to follow. It is at this moment that many get lost in what some philosophical lines call showcase spirituality, a hurried consumption of practices, doctrines, and rituals without time for digestion. 5-minute meditations, memorized prayers, gurus on social media. All of this may even offer temporary relief, but often it doesn't touch the true depth of the search. The seeker then begins to filter. What touches your heart remains. What seems superficial falls away. This purification is silent, made of intuition and discomfort. And gradually, he begins to realize that he is not in search of something outside, but of something inside that has always been there, just forgotten. Curiously, there is a little addressed gap at this stage: spiritual loneliness. Contrary to what many expect, this is not a path full of light and certainties. It is often a journey through internal ruins, where old bonds cease to make sense, and new connections have yet to be born. Friends drift apart, interests change, and the feeling of being a stranger in one's own world intensifies. According to a survey conducted by scholars of comparative spirituality in the 1980s, more than half of the respondents who experienced some type of profound awakening reported a prolonged period of existential disorientation and a compulsive search for meaning. But the beauty of this stage lies precisely there, in the sincerity of the question. Because when the search arises from inner silence, and not from the curiosity of the mind, it begins to guide the seeker along paths that cannot be explained, only lived. This is the phase where knowledge stops being reading and becomes experience. There is no longer any way to pretend. The seeker wants to feel, wants to touch something real, even if it means abandoning everything that seemed safe. And it is precisely in this unstable ground, between unanswered questions and provisional truths, that the next stage begins to emerge: the birth of the true self. Fourth stage: when the mask falls, the emergence of the true self. On day, without warning, you wake up and realize you can no longer maintain the facade. What was once natural: smiling to please, agreeing to avoid conflicts, following patterns, for convenience, begins to weigh like a tight-fitting garment. And for the first time, being yourself stops being a choice and becomes a vital necessity. This is the moment when the authentic self begins to emerge, not as a spiritual ideal, but as a living, untamed presence that refuses to remain hidden. What once seemed like rebellion is now clarity. What once sounded like inadequacy is now integrity. You simply can't pretend anymore. Many describe this phase as a return to childhood, not due to immaturity, but because of the purity of expression. Before the world told us who we should be, we were already something true. And now, this something begins to breathe again, asking for space. This phase, however, is usually accompanied by breakups. Old relationships no longer seem to fit. Certain friendships, once fundamental, now feel artificial. Some professions, choices, and lifestyles simply lose their meaning. There is a constant feeling of dismantling life, but, in reality, what is happening is a deep cleaning so that the new can emerge. It is here that many people experience symptoms rarely discussed in conventional spirituality literature: sleep disturbances, intense dreams, hypersensitivity to environments or noises, the sensation of being out of the body, changes in appetite, emotional spikes without apparent cause. All these signs are often ignored or misinterpreted, but they represent a profound energetic and emotional restructuring. Traditional science still has difficulty understanding these manifestations. Similar reports already appeared in Carl Jung's studies on the process of individuation, where the unconscious self tries to emerge, momentarily disorganizing the established psychic system. But here's the part that few talk about: this stage is also brutally lonely. After all, the truth was never meant to please. When you start being honest with yourself, you inevitably confront all the areas of your life where there has been self-deception. And that hurts. However, this pain is different from the previous confusion. It is precise, revealing. It is the pain of someone being reborn, still covered in dust, but with their eyes finally open. From here on, the process ceases to be merely internal. It begins to manifest in the outside world, not as a revolt, but as coherence. His words change, your habits adjust, your relationships demand more truth. And at the same time that everything seems to be crumbling, something new begins to take hold: yourself. This is the turning point. From now on, the path is no longer about seeking or destroying. It's about living in harmony with what has been revealed, and this is what begins the next and final stage: a life aligned with who you truly are. Fifth stage, the silence that embraces everything. Living in alignment with who you are. Rather comes a moment when the urgency of the search disappears. Not because you have found all the answers, but because you understand that the questions have changed. What was once a race for meaning now becomes an attentive walk, with an open heart to what each moment brings. Life ceases to be an enigma to be deciphered and becomes a dance that you no longer need to control. This is the stage of alignment, not as an unattainable spiritual goal, but as a way of living where the internal and external are no longer in conflict. There is a naturalness, almost silent, that permeates their actions. The choices no longer come from the expectations of others. They come from within. And this, paradoxically, does not generate isolation, but connection. It is common, at this point, for many to report a deep sense of integration with everything that exists. People, nature, objects, even time seems to slow down. Walking among trees ceases to be a stroll, it becomes a reunion. Talking to someone stops being a functional act. It becomes a space of real listening. The doing is no longer agitated. Being is no longer demanding. Life itself begins to adjust to this new rhythm. However, contrary to what many imagine, the stage is not made only of light. There is also pain, chaos, and loss. The difference is that, now, all of this is no longer resisted, it is embraced. The dark aspects of existence are not denied, but integrated. Anger is understood as misdirected energy. Sadness, as a call for retreat. Fear, like an alert that has lost its exaggeration. Contemporary psychology is still crawling in describing this state. Many therapists confuse it with conformity or apathy when, in fact, it is an expanded state of presence, where the being is no longer trying to escape from what it is. Curiously, similar accounts appear in the texts of Sufis, Taoists, Buddhist hermits, and Christian mystics. All speak of that inner place, where the self dissolves, and yet, remains. But perhaps the most subtle aspect of this stage is the birth of compassion. Not the superficial compassion that tries to fix others, but the one that recognizes that each being is exactly where they need to be, even if they seem lost. You begin to see the other as an extension of the same process that transformed you, and with that, a natural kindness emerges towards others, towards life, and especially towards yourself. In this state, the body is no longer an obstacle, but a temple. Relationships cease to be arenas of validation and become mirrors. And time is no longer a villain. It becomes the fabric where the soul slowly embroiders its expression. Alignment is not a final point. It is just the beginning of a way of living where the sacred is in the simple, in the act of breathing, in the act of listening, in the choice to stay. Even when everything around insists on rushing, you learn to stay. And it is there, in the silence between one thought and another, that the journey reveals its true purpose. Not to transform you into someone better, but to finally allow you to be just who you have always been. When the path becomes silencing, then, after so many detours, breakups, and reunions, you realize the journey was never about reaching a destination. It was about remembering the way back home. Inward, there is no trophy at the end, nor absolute answers. There is only a space vaster than words, calmer than promises, where everything simply is. You no longer need to fight to be something. You no longer feel the need to prove anything. And curiously, isn't that exact moment of non-effort that something essential awakens? A silent presence, a feeling that has no form, but sustains you entirely. Real spirituality, the kind that springs from experience and not from books, is not a lofty destination. It is a way of being present, even when nothing makes sense. It is accepting that pain also teaches, that chaos also organizes, that even emptiness has its fruits. If you have made it this far and felt something pulse between the words, a dormant memory, a forgotten doubt, a desire to look within, perhaps this is not by chance. Maybe you are, without realizing it, in the middle of a process that most people can't even imagine exists. And if that's the case, don't rush. There is no finish line. There is no precise map. There are no numbered steps. There is only listening. Listening to oneself in silence. Listen to the world with fewer judgments. Listening to life as if conversing with time. This is the true spiritual journey, an invisible crossing, made in the territory of the soul, where each step reveals less who you should be, and more who you already are. Behind it all, maybe the question isn't, what stage are you in? But rather, how much are you willing to allow yourself to listen to what has never been said, but has always been felt? Until the next crossing.